Montana Territory, 1876. Dawn broke over the eastern ridge of the valley, painting the sky in watercolor strokes of amber and violet. Ethan Blackwood stood motionless on the porch of his weathered cabin, Winchester cradled in calloused hands. His eyes, the pale blue of winter sky, narrowed against the rising light as he scanned the distant tree line. The rustlers had returned. 3 nights now, tracks in the soft spring mud, cattle spooked before dawn. Ethan had been ranching this land long enough to read the signs. Someone was testing his borders, taking measure of his vigilance. A flicker of movement caught his attention. There, at the edge of the east pasture, a figure on horseback, thinking himself concealed by the tall grass. Ethan raised the Winchester to his shoulder, drew a slow breath, and compensated 2 inches for the morning crosswind. The model 1873 was perfectly balanced in his grip, an extension of his arm rather than a tool. He aimed 3 feet above the rider's head and squeezed the trigger. The report echoed across the valley. Birds scattered from the cottonwoods along the creek. The distant rider jerked upright, then wheeled his horse and galloped toward the tree line. A warning shot, nothing more. Ethan Blackwood was not a man who killed lightly, but neither was he one to be trifled with. "Reckon he got the message," came a gravelly voice behind him. Moses Grant emerged from the barn, wiping axle grease from gnarled hands. At 70, Moses moved slower than in his younger days, but his eyes missed nothing. "For now," Ethan replied, lowering the rifle. "They'll be back, likely with friends." "Always are." Moses spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. "World's full of men wanting something for nothing." Ethan nodded, turning to survey his land in the strengthening light. The Blackwood Ranch spread across 200 acres of Montana territory, nestled in a fertile valley between pine-covered ridges. Not the largest spread in the territory, but good land. Land that men like Jackson Hardy would happily take, given half a chance. The thought of Hardy soured his stomach. The banker turned a land speculator, had been circling like a vulture since acquiring Ethan's loan notes from the bank in Helena. $1,200 due in 6 months. A fortune to a man who counted wealth in cattle and acres rather than dollars and cents. "Stage is due today," Moses remarked, watching Ethan's face carefully. "Still set on this mail order business?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "Nothing to discuss, Moses." "Plenty to discuss, just nothing you want to hear." The old man limped closer, voice dropping. "Rebecca's been gone 3 years now, Ethan. Nobody would fault you for seeking companionship the regular way, courting a local woman." The name hit Ethan like a physical blow. Rebecca, his wife of 8 years, taken by typhoid while he was away trading cattle in Wyoming. 3 days of fever, and she was gone before he could reach her side. The doctor said nothing could have saved her, but Ethan carried the absence like a bullet lodged too close to the heart to remove. "This isn't about companionship," Ethan said flatly. "It's business. The land trust Rebecca's father set up requires a wife to maintain inheritance. You know that." Moses snorted. "Your father-in-law's been dead 5 years. Nobody's checking those papers." "I am." Ethan's voice was quiet but final. "I gave my word to care for this land. I intend to keep it." The old man shook his head, but knew better than to push. Ethan Blackwood had served as a Union Army scout during the war between the states, developing the stubborn resilience that kept a man alive behind enemy lines. Once his mind was set, it was like trying to move a mountain with a garden spade. "Mail order bride," Moses muttered. "Woman don't even know what she's getting herself into." Ethan turned toward the house. "Neither do I, Moses. Neither do I." The interior of the ranch house reflected 3 years of masculine neglect. Not filthy, but austere and utilitarian. Dishes sat clean but stacked haphazardly on open shelves. The hearth needed sweeping. Ethan moved through the main room with military efficiency, straightening what he could in the hour before the stage would arrive. He paused before a small photograph on the mantel, the only adornment in the sparse room. Rebecca smiled from behind the glass, her eyes bright with life that the camera had somehow captured. Ethan touched the frame briefly, then turned away. From the small wooden box on the table, he removed the agreement from the matrimonial agency. The paper was creased from repeated readings, the flowing script promising to deliver a suitable woman of good character and practical disposition in exchange for passage west. Hannah Sullivan from Boston, Massachusetts, 32 years old, former nurse during the war, no family attachments, $5,000. That was what Ethan's life amounted to in financial terms. The accumulated wealth of 12 years ranching minus the debt. Not a sum to impress banking men like Hardy, but enough to make this land worth stealing through legal chicanery. The land itself, though, that was beyond price. The fertile bottomland along the creek, the timber-rich slopes, the high summer pasture, land that would increase tenfold in value once the Northern Pacific Railroad pushed through, land that Hardy and his investors coveted like gold. Ethan checked his pocket watch. 7:30. The stage from Helena would be arriving soon. He straightened his collar in the small mirror, noting the gray beginning to thread through his dark hair at the temples. At 42, the lines around his eyes had deepened, weathered by sun and wind and loss. Not the face of a young bridegroom. But then, this wasn't about romance. This was survival. The distant rumble of the approaching stagecoach pulled Ethan from his thoughts. He stepped onto the porch, watched the cloud of dust moving along the valley road. Moses emerged from the barn again, curiosity overcoming his disapproval. "Remember," the old man said quietly, "this woman gave up everything she knows to come here. Whatever your arrangement, she deserves kindness." Ethan nodded once, jaw tight. The stage rounded the final bend, 4 horses pulling the mud-spattered coach toward the ranch house. The driver, a weathered man named Turner, grinned down from his perch as he reined the team to a halt. "Special delivery, Blackwood," he called, too cheerfully for Ethan's comfort. Turner jumped down to open the coach door, offering his hand inside with theatrical gallantry. "Watch your step now, ma'am." A gloved hand emerged, followed by the dark fabric of a traveling dress. A woman stepped carefully down from the coach, her face obscured by a heavy black veil that fell from her bonnet. She stood very straight, her posture almost military in its precision. Smaller than Ethan had expected, the top of her veiled head would barely reach his shoulder. For a moment, neither moved. The only sound was the impatient stamping of the stage horses and the wind rustling through spring grass. Then Ethan stepped forward, removing his hat. "Miss Sullivan, I'm Ethan Blackwood." The woman's head tilted slightly. "Mr. Blackwood." Her voice was clear and steady, with the refined accent of the eastern seaboard. No tremor of fear or uncertainty. She reached up and slowly lifted her veil. Ethan's carefully prepared greeting died in his throat. The left side of her face was striking in its classical proportion, with a high cheekbone, clear gray eye, and smooth skin. But the right side was a landscape of devastation. Puckered scar tissue stretched from her temple down past her jawline, pulling at the corner of her eye and mouth. The marks of fire unmistakable to anyone who had seen the aftermath of battle. Ethan froze, aware of Moses and the stage driver watching, aware of his own failure to mask his shock. Something in the woman's expression hardened, a shield rising behind her eyes. "The agency didn't inform you," she said flatly. It wasn't a question. Ethan found his voice. "No, they did not." She nodded once, as if confirming a long-held suspicion. "I understand if you wish to void our arrangement. I can return on the next eastbound stage." Her dignity cut through Ethan's shock. She stood unflinching in the Montana sunlight, offering him an easy escape from their agreement. No pleading, no excuses. Just a woman who had clearly faced rejection before and was prepared to face it again. In his mind, Ethan heard Rebecca's voice, clear as the day she'd spoken the words. "A man's true nature shows itself when faced with something he fears." The stage driver spat into the dust. "Better decide quick, Blackwood. I got a schedule to keep." Hannah Sullivan continued to meet his gaze steadily, waiting for his judgment with a stoicism that spoke of long practice. "The agreement stands," Ethan said finally, his voice rougher than intended. "Welcome to Blackwood Ranch, Miss Sullivan." Something flickered across her face. Surprise, perhaps, or relief quickly masked. "Thank you." Turner snorted and moved to retrieve her trunk from the coach. "Good luck to you both," he said with poorly concealed skepticism. "You'll need it out here." Hannah turned to watch him manhandle the small trunk to the ground. "I can manage my own belongings, Mr. Turner," she said coolly, moving to take the handle. "As you wish, ma'am." The driver tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy and climbed back onto his perch. "Afternoon, Blackwood." With a crack of his whip, the stage pulled away, leaving a settling cloud of dust. Ethan stepped forward. "Let me take your trunk." "That isn't necessary." Hannah gripped the handle firmly. "I insist." Ethan didn't wait for her response, lifting the trunk easily. It was surprisingly light for someone who had traveled across the country to start a new life. Everything she owned in the world, contained in a space smaller than a cattle feed box. Hannah stood a moment longer, then turned toward the house. Ethan followed, aware of Moses watching from near the barn, his expression unreadable. Inside, Hannah removed her bonnet, revealing dark hair pulled back in a severe knot at the nape of her neck. She surveyed the main room with a clinical gaze, taking inventory of her new surroundings. Ethan suddenly saw the house through her eyes. The sparse furnishings, the functional bareness, the absence of feminine touches. "The bedroom is upstairs," he began awkwardly. "I can show you." "Is there a smaller room?" she interrupted. "Perhaps for household help?" Ethan frowned. "There's a room off the kitchen. It was meant for a housekeeper, but that will be suitable." Hannah moved toward the kitchen, her movements efficient and purposeful. She found the door to the small room without direction, opening it to reveal a plain space with a narrow bed, small dresser, and window overlooking the kitchen garden. Ethan followed, confusion overriding his earlier discomfort. "This isn't appropriate. As my wife, you should take the main bedroom." Hannah turned to face him fully, and Ethan realized this was the first time she had done so since arriving. Standing in the doorway of the small room, she drew herself up to her full height. "Mr. Blackwood, let's be clear about the nature of our arrangement. I am here to work, to maintain your household, and to fulfill the legal requirements of your land trust. I have no illusions about romance or conventional marriage. This room will serve my needs adequately." Her directness caught him off guard. The matrimonial agency had promised a practical disposition, but he hadn't expected such forthrightness. It was both unsettling and oddly refreshing after years of dancing around painful subjects with neighbors and acquaintances. "As you wish," he conceded, setting her trunk inside the room. "But the offer remains open, should you change your mind." Something that might have been amusement flickered in her gray eyes. "Noted, Mr. Blackwood." A moment of awkward silence stretched between them. "I'll leave you to settle in," Ethan said finally. "Supper is at 6. Hannah nodded, already turning her attention to unpacking. The dismissal was polite but unmistakable. Ethan backed out of the doorway, oddly relieved to escape the intensity of her presence. In the barn, Moses was checking a horse's hoof for stones. He glanced up as Ethan entered, but didn't immediately speak, waiting for Ethan to break the silence. "She was a nurse in the war," Ethan said finally, picking up a curry comb and applying it to his gelding's flank with more force than necessary. Moses nodded. "Explains the scars. Hospital fire, most likely." "You saw, then?" "Hard to miss." The old man replaced the horse's hoof gently on the ground. "Not what you expected." Ethan continued brushing, focusing on the rhythmic strokes. "Not what anyone would expect." "She staying?" "Yes." Moses studied him. "That your choice or hers?" Ethan paused, remembering Hannah's quiet dignity as she offered to leave. "Both, I suppose." The old man nodded, satisfied. "Good woman knows her own mind. Might be exactly what this place needs." He spat tobacco juice into the straw. "Better than some delicate eastern flower who'd wilt at the first Montana winter." Ethan had no response to that. Hannah Sullivan was certainly no delicate flower. There was steel in her spine and ice in her voice. But behind that composed exterior, he had glimpsed something else. Vulnerability carefully guarded. A woman who had learned the hard way to expect the worst from others. By evening, Ethan returned from checking fence lines to find the house transformed. The floors were swept, dishes organized, surfaces dusted. The scent of cooking filled the air, replacing the stale bachelor atmosphere. Hannah moved about the kitchen with practiced efficiency, her dark skirt swishing as she worked. Supper was simple but well prepared. Salt pork, beans with herbs, and fresh biscuits. They ate in near silence, the clink of cutlery against plates the primary conversation. Ethan found himself watching Hannah when she wasn't looking. She ate neatly, with the precise movements that seemed to characterize everything she did. Finally, seeking to break the oppressive quiet, Ethan cleared his throat. How long were you a nurse, Miss Sullivan? She looked up, seemingly surprised by the question. 4 years, from 61 to 65. The entire war. Yes, she took a sip of water. I volunteered after Bull Run. I was 27, unmarried, with some education in herbal medicine from my mother. It seemed the only useful thing to do. Ethan nodded, respecting her straightforward answer. You saw combat hospitals then? Many. A shadow crossed her face. Too many. That's where Ethan gestured vaguely toward the right side of his own face, immediately regretting the question. Hannah's expression didn't change. Yes, a field hospital near Petersburg. Confederate artillery. The shell hit the medical supplies first. Those of us near the back had time to get some patients out. The matter-of-fact recounting of what must have been hell on earth struck Ethan forcefully. This woman had seen the worst of humanity and carried the physical proof permanently etched into her skin. Yet here she sat, calmly eating dinner and discussing it as one might discuss the weather. I was a scout, Ethan offered. Union Army, Tennessee mostly, sometimes Virginia. Hannah studied him with new interest. Dangerous work. It had its moments. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. I imagine it did. Something shifted between them. Not warmth exactly, but recognition. Two survivors of the same terrible conflict, shaped by different traumas but bearing similar scars, visible and invisible. After dinner, Hannah washed the dishes while Ethan brought in more firewood for the morning. The marriage license sat unsigned on the mantel, neither of them mentioning it. The legal document that would bind them seemed secondary to the unspoken negotiations happening with every interaction. Night fell over the ranch, stars emerging in the vast Montana sky. Ethan sat on the porch, whittling a piece of pine wood, as was his evening habit. The repetitive motion cleared his mind, allowed him to process the day's events. Inside, he could hear Hannah moving about, the quiet domestic sounds, both foreign and vaguely comforting after years of silence. The next morning dawned clear and cool. Ethan rose before sunrise, his body conditioned to the rhythms of ranch life. To his surprise, Hannah was already awake, coffee brewing on the stove. She wore a practical dark dress with her hair neatly pinned, looking as if she had been part of the household for years rather than hours. Good morning, Mr. Blackwood. She handed him a cup of coffee, strong and hot, just as he preferred it. Thank you. He accepted the cup, noticing that she had organized his papers on the table, stacking them neatly without disturbing their order. Observant, then. I've taken inventory of the kitchen supplies, she said, all business. You're low on flour and salt. The root cellar needs better organization before summer, and the chicken coop should be repaired before acquiring new layers. Ethan blinked at the assessment. You've been busy. I rise early, always have. She poured her own coffee. I also noticed your work shirt has a tear in the right sleeve. I can mend it today if you have another to wear. The domestic efficiency was both impressive and slightly overwhelming. Ethan had grown accustomed to handling everything himself, making do with patched clothes and simple meals. Having someone else notice these details made him acutely aware of how Spartan his existence had become. The shirt can wait, he said, oddly discomfited. I need to check the north pasture today. We lost some fencing in the last storm. Hannah nodded. I'll focus on the house then. Will Mr. Grant be joining us for supper? Moses? Sometimes. He has his own cabin near the barn, but he eats here most days. Ethan hesitated. He's been with this land longer than I have. Came west with Rebecca's father after the Mexican War. It was the first time he had mentioned Rebecca by name. The word hung in the air between them, acknowledging the ghost that inhabited the ranch. Hannah's expression softened slightly. I'll plan for 3 then. Ethan nodded, finished his coffee, and escaped to the familiar routine of ranch work. Throughout the day, he found his thoughts returning to the house, to Hannah Sullivan and her scarred face and capable hands. She was nothing like what he had expected, nothing like Rebecca with her gentle humor and soft voice. Yet there was something compelling about her directness, her refusal to hide either her face or her nature. The week passed in a similar fashion. Hannah transformed the house methodically, room by room. Ethan would return from working the land to find another space reclaimed from dust and neglect. She cleaned with military precision, organized with pragmatic efficiency, and cooked simple but satisfying meals. They established a careful routine, orbiting each other with polite distance. The unsigned marriage license remained on the mantel, a silent acknowledgement of the temporary nature of their arrangement. Hannah never mentioned it, and Ethan found himself reluctant to press the issue. The legal necessity could wait. For now, they were testing boundaries, learning the landscape of coexistence. On the seventh day, Ethan announced they would travel to town the following morning for supplies. Hannah received this news with a slight stiffening of her shoulders, the only indication of discomfort. Is that necessary? We have adequate provisions for another week. The general store receives its shipment tomorrow. Best selection. Ethan studied her reaction. Unless you'd prefer not to go. Hannah met his gaze directly. It isn't a matter of preference, Mr. Blackwood. I'm simply being practical. But Ethan recognized the evasion for what it was. The people of Clearwater will meet you eventually, Miss Sullivan. Better to face them directly than give them reason to speculate. A shadow passed over her face, darkening her eyes. Yes, speculation does tend to be worse than reality. She turned away, busying herself with the dishes. Very well, tomorrow then. That evening, Ethan found his black Sunday coat laid out on his bed, brushed clean of dust, the buttons polished. A small gesture, but it struck him forcefully. How long had it been since anyone had thought to prepare his clothes? Since anyone had cared about such details in his life? The simple domestic act carried a weight beyond its practical value. Morning brought overcast skies and the threat of rain. Hannah appeared dressed for town in a severe black dress and the same veiled bonnet she had worn upon arrival. The sight of the veil twisted something in Ethan's chest. She was armoring herself, preparing for battle rather than a simple trip to town. They rode in the wagon in silence, the rhythmic creak of wheels and clop of hooves the only conversation. As they crested the final hill, the town of Clearwater came into view in the valley below. A single main street lined with false-fronted buildings, a white church steeple, the cluster of activity that constituted the Saturday market. A typical Montana settlement, growing steadily with the promise of the approaching railroad. Hannah's posture became increasingly rigid as they approached. Ethan glanced at her gloved hands, noticing how tightly they gripped her reticule. Her knuckles would be white beneath the fabric. Clearwater's not much, he offered. General store, bank, saloon, a doctor who's more skilled with horses than people. The usual. Hannah nodded once, the veil hiding her expression. I've seen small towns before, Mr. Blackwood. The people here can be curious about newcomers. People everywhere are curious about those who are different. Her voice was cool. I've had considerable experience with curiosity. Ethan fell silent, recognizing the futility of reassurance. Hannah Sullivan knew exactly what to expect. She had faced it before, would face it again. His words would change nothing. They pulled up outside the general store, already busy with Saturday shoppers. Ethan helped Hannah down from the wagon, aware of heads turning, conversations pausing, as townsfolk noticed the veiled woman. News of Blackwood's mail-order bride had clearly spread. Before they could enter the store, a plump woman in an expensive dress intercepted them, her smile wide and artificial. Mr. Blackwood, what a pleasure to see you in town. Her eyes fixed on Hannah with poorly disguised curiosity. And this must be your new companion. Mrs. Palmer, this is Hannah Sullivan. Ethan kept his introduction deliberately vague, unwilling to define Hannah's status to satisfy the minister's wife's nosiness. Miss Sullivan, how wonderful to meet you. Mrs. Palmer's voice dripped with exaggerated kindness. We've all been so concerned about poor Mr. Blackwood, alone in that big house these past years. Such a Christian act for you to come keep him company. Hannah's spine straightened imperceptibly. Thank you for your concern, Mrs. Palmer. Mr. Blackwood and I have business at the store. The polite dismissal seemed to catch Mrs. Palmer off guard. She stepped aside, watching as they entered the general store. Inside, the same pattern repeated. Conversations hushed as they entered, eyes following Hannah's veiled figure, speculative whispers barely masked by the pretense of shopping. Hannah selected items with quiet efficiency: flour, coffee, salt, a bolt of sturdy cotton. Ethan added tools and nails to their purchases, painfully aware of the attention they were attracting. The storekeeper's wife stared openly. Two young women giggled behind a display of fabric bolts, their eyes darting repeatedly toward Hannah. As Ethan paid for their goods, he felt heat rising in his collar. Not embarrassment for Hannah, but anger at the townspeople, at their petty curiosity and poorly concealed judgment. And beneath the anger, shame at his own initial reaction to her scarred face. Had he looked at her with the same shocked pity that now filled the store? Outside, they loaded supplies into the wagon. Ethan was securing the last sack when a tall figure blocked the sunlight. Jackson Hardy stood before them, impeccably dressed as always, his silver watch chain gleaming across his vest. Behind him stood two associates, men who did Hardy's less reputable work. Blackwood, Hardy nodded with false cordiality. Making preparations for improvements to the ranch? His smile didn't reach his eyes. Seems a shame to invest in land you'll be leaving so soon. Ethan's hands stilled on the rope. My plans haven't changed, Hardy. No, $1,200 is a substantial sum for a small cattle operation, especially with beef prices falling. Hardy turned his attention to Hannah. And you must be the mail-order bride I've heard about. He tipped his hat with exaggerated courtesy. Jackson Hardy, ma'am, Clearwater Bank and Land Investment. Welcome to our little community. Hannah inclined her head slightly, but remained silent behind her veil. Hardy's smile turned predatory. I must say, Blackwood, I admire your charitable spirit. Not many men would take on such a commitment under your financial circumstances. The implication hung in the air, ugly and deliberate. Ethan felt his fists clench, the familiar heat of anger spreading through his chest. Hardy was baiting him, hoping for a reaction that would damage his reputation further. Before Ethan could respond, Hannah moved forward, reaching for a heavy sack of flour still on the boardwalk. Without a word, she lifted it and carried it to the wagon herself, her movements deliberate and dignified. The physical strength required for the task surprised the onlookers, contradicting the image of frailty her veiled appearance might have suggested. She turned to face Hardy, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden silence. Mr. Hardy, I understand you acquired Mr. Blackwood's loan under questionable circumstances. I wonder if the Territorial Banking Commission would find your methods as admirable as you find my husband's charity. Hardy's face darkened. You should educate your bride on the dangers of slander, Blackwood. And you should remember that I served with Judge Wilson during the war, Ethan replied evenly. He has a particular dislike for financial manipulation. The banker's smile vanished entirely. 6 months, Blackwood. Not a day more. He turned on his heel, gesturing for his men to follow. Hannah climbed onto the wagon without assistance. Ethan joined her, taking up the reins in silence. As they pulled away from Clearwater, he could feel the tension radiating from her rigid posture. I apologize for Hardy, he said finally as the town disappeared behind them. He's been trying to acquire land along the expected railroad route. Men like him exist everywhere. Hannah's voice was tight. Using legal means for theft because they lack the courage for honest robbery. The assessment was so accurate that Ethan nearly smiled despite the lingering anger. You handled yourself well back there. I've had practice. She turned her head away, looking out at the passing landscape. Your townspeople are exactly what I expected, Mr. Blackwood. No better, no worse. The hurt beneath her pragmatic tone was unmistakable. Ethan wanted to offer some defense of Clearwater, some reassurance that things would improve, but the words would ring hollow. Instead, they completed the journey in silence, each lost in private thoughts. That evening, Ethan sat at his kitchen table, the marriage license before him. The encounter in town had clarified something he had been avoiding. Hannah Sullivan had kept her part of their arrangement, bringing order to his home and presenting herself as his wife to the community. Yet he had left her vulnerable, legally unprotected. The unsigned document was a constant reminder of the tentative nature of their situation. He took up the pen and signed his name with the decisive strokes of a man accustomed to honoring contracts. Ethan James Blackwood, a commitment made in ink rather than emotion, but binding nonetheless. Hannah emerged from her room, wrapped in a shawl against the evening chill. She paused when she saw the document on the table, saw his signature bold and black against the paper. Why now? Her voice was barely audible. Ethan looked up at her, noticing how the lamplight caught the unmarred side of her face, revealing a beauty that might have been in another lifetime. Because I made a promise, I keep my promises. She studied him for a long moment, as if searching for some hidden motive. Then she sat down across from him and picked up the pen, her hand steady as she signed, Hannah Sullivan Blackwood. The contract became covenant. Neither knew exactly what kind. March wind rattled the windows that night, forewarning of the spring storm that would soon sweep across the valley. In her small room, Hannah removed the pins from her hair, letting the dark waves fall around her shoulders. She touched the right side of her face, fingers tracing the familiar landscape of scars, reassuring herself they were still there, still defining her. She was now, legally, Mrs. Blackwood. The name sat strangely on her conscience. This arrangement was meant to be practical, functional, a transaction with clear boundaries. Yet today, watching Ethan's controlled anger when Hardy insulted her, something had shifted. A crack in the careful distance they maintained. Hannah moved to the window, looking out at the barn's dark silhouette. She had researched Ethan Blackwood before agreeing to come west. A Union Army scout with an honorable record. A widower with a solid reputation. A man with land, but financial troubles. All factual, verifiable information that had made him seem a safe choice. What her research hadn't revealed was the quiet dignity in his bearing, the respect he showed Moses, the way his hands, calloused from ranch work, could move with unexpected gentleness, the depth of grief still visible in his eyes when he spoke his dead wife's name. 1 week, she whispered to her reflection in the glass. If he sends me away, I'll go west to Oregon or California. No one knows me there. She would survive. She always did. The next morning brought dark clouds and the first drops of rain. By noon, the spring storm had settled in earnest over the valley, turning the ranch yard to mud and sending livestock seeking shelter. Ethan worked through the downpour, securing buildings and animals against the worsening weather. Hannah watched from the kitchen window as he led the last horse into the barn, his coat slick with rain, hat pulled low against the wind. There was something admirable in his methodical care for the land and animals, a responsibility he bore without complaint. Thunder rolled across the valley, followed by a sharp crack of lightning. The storm was intensifying. Hannah put coffee on to boil, knowing Ethan would be cold and wet when he finally came inside. As she worked, she found herself humming softly, an old ballad her mother had sung during storms to calm her childhood fears. The door burst open, bringing a gust of rain and wind. Ethan stood in the doorway, water streaming from his oilskin coat. "Storm's turning bad," he announced, removing his dripping hat. "Creek's rising fast. I need to move the cattle from the lower pasture." Hannah handed him the hot coffee. "Lone, in this weather?" "Moses is checking the north fence line. Can't wait." He drank the coffee in 3 long swallows, the warmth bringing color back to his wind-chapped face. "Then I'll come with you." Hannah was already reaching for her coat. Ethan frowned. "That's not necessary." "It wasn't a question, Mr. Blackwood." She met his gaze steadily. "2 people can work faster than one. I grew up on a farm in Pennsylvania. I know livestock." He studied her for a moment, clearly weighing the danger against the need for assistance. Finally, he nodded once. "Wear the oilskin from the mudroom, and stay close." The storm transformed the familiar landscape into something wild and dangerous. Rain fell in blinding sheets. The creek had swollen into a churning mass that strained against its banks. 20 head of cattle huddled miserably in the lower pasture, which was rapidly becoming a shallow lake. Ethan and Hannah worked in wordless coordination, using practiced signals and gestures where voices would be lost to the howling wind. Hannah showed no hesitation, riding directly into the nervous herd, turning the cattle toward higher ground with confidence and skill. The last heifer was halfway across the rising stream when she balked, refusing to move further. Hannah dismounted without hesitation, wading into the knee-deep water to guide the frightened animal. The current tugged at her skirts, threatening her balance on the slick creek bed. Ethan moved his horse alongside hers, reaching down to grasp her arm as the heifer finally lurched forward. In that moment of shared purpose, something wordless passed between them. Trust, perhaps, or recognition of a kindred resilience. By the time they returned to the ranch house, both were soaked to the skin despite the oilskins. Night had fallen, transforming the windows into black mirrors reflecting the lamplight. Moses had returned, reporting minimal damage to the north fencing, but bringing news of a downed tree across the road to town. "We're cut off for a few days, most like," the old man said, accepting a bowl of stew from Hannah with grateful hands. Lest someone clears that oak, and it's a big one. Ethan nodded, unsurprised. Spring storms often isolated the ranch temporarily. They had adequate provisions and sturdy shelter. The isolation was familiar, even welcome sometimes. What was unfamiliar was sharing this isolation with Hannah. The storm had changed something between them. Her competence during the emergency had earned his respect in a way that domestic skills could not. And something in her had softened toward him as well, the careful distance diminishing as they worked together against a common threat. After supper, Moses retired to his cabin despite the rain, leaving Ethan and Hannah alone in the lamplit kitchen. Hannah hung their wet clothes near the stove to dry, moving with the slight stiffness of exhaustion. Ethan built up the fire, aware of her presence in a way he hadn't been before. "You handled yourself well out there," he said finally, breaking the comfortable silence. "Not many women would have waded into that creek." Hannah smiled faintly. "Not many men would have allowed it. I've learned to recognize capability when I see it." Ethan added another log to the fire. "Your farm in Pennsylvania, was it large?" "Modest, 40 acres. My father grew wheat and kept dairy cows." Her voice softened with memory. "He believed daughters should learn everything sons did. Said you never know what life will require of you." "Wise man." "Yes." Hannah's expression grew distant. He would have liked this land, the openness of it, the potential. Something in her tone caught Ethan's attention. "You see it too then? The potential." She nodded slowly. "With proper management, this valley could support twice the cattle you currently run. The soil near the creek is ideal for certain crops. And the position, with the railroad coming." She trailed off, perhaps realizing the enthusiasm in her voice. Ethan studied her with new interest. Most people saw only the harsh present of frontier life, the difficulties and isolation. Few recognized the future waiting to be built. "Rebecca used to say the same," he said quietly, "that this land was waiting to become something greater." Hannah met his eyes, surprised by the voluntary mention of his wife. "She sounds like a remarkable woman." She was. The familiar pain of loss rose in his chest, but somehow less sharp than before. This was her father's land originally. She loved it as much as I do. Hannah nodded, understanding in her gray eyes. "Then we share a purpose, Mr. Blackwood. To honor that love by preserving what she valued." The simple statement struck Ethan with unexpected force. Hannah had distilled their arrangement to its essence, finding the meaning beneath the practical necessity. Not romance, but purpose. Not passion, but shared values. Later, as the storm raged outside, Hannah fell asleep in the chair by the fire, a darning basket still in her lap. Ethan watched the firelight play across her features, softening the division between scarred and unmarred skin. In sleep, the guarded expression she maintained during waking hours fell away, revealing the vulnerabilities she kept carefully hidden. He should wake her, send her to her room. Their boundaries were clear, their arrangement defined. But something held him motionless, watching the gentle rise and fall of her breathing, seeing not the scars but the strength beneath them. A woman who had faced fire, who had lost as he had lost, who understood the value of this land because she recognized what it could become. Moving carefully, Ethan lifted her from the chair. She was lighter than expected, her head resting against his shoulder as he carried her to her room. The intimacy of the moment caught in his throat, a breach of the careful distance they had maintained. Yet it felt right, this small act of care. He laid her gently on the narrow bed, drawing the quilt over her still form. Hannah murmured something unintelligible, turning her face into the pillow without waking. Ethan stood in the doorway, watching her for a moment longer. The storm had changed things between them in ways he couldn't yet define. The careful transaction they had agreed upon was becoming something more complex, more dangerous to his carefully guarded heart. As he turned away, closing her door softly behind him, Ethan acknowledged the truth he had been avoiding since her arrival. Hannah Sullivan Blackwood was not a temporary solution to a legal problem. She was becoming essential to his vision of the future, to the land, and perhaps, if he dared admit it, to himself. Outside, the storm continued its assault on the Montana night, but inside the ranch house, something new had taken root. Not love, not yet, but possibility. And for now, that was enough. April bloomed across Montana territory, painting the valley in vivid greens and wildflower hues. The storm had passed, leaving behind rushing streams and renewed life. Blackwood Ranch emerged from winter's grip, transformed by spring's promise and Hannah Sullivan's methodical hand. Ethan stood at the edge of the newly plowed garden plot, watching Hannah work the rich soil. She moved with steady purpose, her dark skirts pinned up practically, strong hands guiding the hoe with practiced efficiency. A few tendrils of hair had escaped her usual severe knot, curling damply against her neck in the morning warmth. "You've chosen good ground," Ethan observed, stepping closer to examine her work. "This soil holds moisture better than the western slope." Hannah nodded without looking up. "The drainage is superior here, and it catches morning sun while providing afternoon shade from that cottonwood." She paused, wiping her brow with her sleeve. "My father always said location matters more than effort when it comes to growing." "Smart man." Ethan knelt, taking a handful of the dark earth, letting it sift through his fingers. "What are you planning to plant? Potatoes, beans, carrots, staples first." Hannah's expression softened slightly. "In a small herb garden for medicinals. Yarrow for wounds, echinacea for infection, willow bark for pain." Ethan's eyebrows rose. "You know herbs that well?" Formal medicine was often in short supply during the war. Her voice took on the matter-of-fact tone she used when discussing difficult subjects. "We learned to use what nature provided. Sometimes it worked better than the doctor's remedies." Ethan nodded, impressed despite himself. He had encountered battlefield surgeons whose knowledge extended no further than amputation and morphine. "Show me what you need for the herb section. I can build raised beds with better soil." Something like surprise flickered across Hannah's face. "That would be helpful. Thank you." The simple exchange felt significant somehow, an acknowledgement of permanence, of building something to last beyond the season. Ethan found himself unexpectedly pleased by her acceptance of his assistance. In the 2 weeks since the storm, their careful orbits had begun to overlap more frequently, collaboration replacing mere coexistence. Moses approached from the barn, his uneven gait recognizable even at a distance. "Riders coming," he called, pointing toward the valley entrance. "3 of them, moving slow." Ethan straightened, hand instinctively checking for the knife at his belt. "Stay here," he told Hannah, striding toward the house where his Winchester waited above the door. Hannah ignored the instruction, following him to the porch. Who would it be? Could be anything. Travelers seeking shelter. Neighbors. Ethan's jaw tightened. Or Hardy's men. They watched as the riders emerged from the tree line and made their way up the valley road. As they drew closer, Ethan's shoulders relaxed marginally. "The Prescott boys," he said, recognizing the lead rider, "from the next valley over." Hannah retreated slightly, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the right side of her face. Ethan noticed the gesture, understanding its meaning without comment. New people meant new reactions to navigate, new judgments to endure. The Prescott brothers reined their horses to a stop before the house. James, the eldest, raised a hand in greeting. "Blackwood, good to see you." "Prescott." Ethan descended the porch steps. "What brings you this way?" James dismounted, dusting trail dirt from his clothes. "Cattle business. Got a proposition for you." His eyes drifted past Ethan to Hannah, standing half-shadowed in the doorway. Surprise registered briefly on his weathered face, but to his credit, he masked it quickly. "Ma'am," he nodded respectfully. Ethan turned slightly. "Hannah, this is James Prescott and his brothers, Thomas and Daniel. They run cattle 3 valleys east." He hesitated briefly. "James, this is my wife, Hannah Blackwood." The formal introduction, the first time Ethan had used her married name in public, hung in the air. Hannah stepped forward into the sunlight, her chin lifted slightly in the subtle defiance Ethan had come to recognize. "Mr. Prescott," she acknowledged, "you've had a long ride. Would you care for coffee?" James removed his hat. "Much obliged, Mrs. Blackwood." The domestic routine that followed felt strangely normal. Hannah prepared coffee while the men settled at the kitchen table. Moses joined them, greeting the Prescotts with the familiarity of long acquaintance. The conversation turned to the spring calving, grass conditions, and the usual concerns of ranchers emerging from winter. "Heard about your trouble with Hardy," James said finally, setting down his cup. "Man's been buying up every debt he can find, foreclosing fast as courts will allow." Ethan nodded grimly. 1,200 due in September. He's counting on me not having it. That's why we're here. James leaned forward. Railroad surveyors came through last month. Line's definite now, coming through Clearwater by year's end. We knew that was likely. What you might not know is they're setting up a shipping yard. Need cattle to feed the workers. James smiled slightly. Army's also looking for beef contracts. Price is climbing. Thomas, the younger brother, spoke up. We got an offer for 30 head, but they want 50. Thought maybe you'd want in. 20 of yours, 30 of ours, split the profits. Ethan calculated quickly. At current prices, his share would be nearly $400, a significant step toward paying Hardy, but nowhere near enough. It's a good offer, he said carefully, but 20 head would leave me thin through summer. We thought of that too, James replied. Daniel here has been working on a new grazing rotation. Shows promise for increasing weight without overgrazing. Figured you might be interested in trying it. The conversation shifted to grazing techniques, breeding plans, and market projections. Through it all, Hannah moved quietly around the kitchen, serving coffee and eventually a simple lunch of bread and cold meat. But Ethan noticed she was listening intently, her expression thoughtful as the men discussed cattle yields and grazing methods. Later, when the Prescotts prepared to leave, Hannah approached James directly. Mr. Prescott, before you go, might I ask about your cheese production? The rancher looked surprised. Ma'am? I noticed your brother mentioned dairy cows at your home place. Are you producing cheese commercially or just for household use? James scratched his beard. Just household, ma'am. My sister-in-law makes a decent cheddar, but nothing fancy. Hannah nodded. The railroad workers you mentioned, they'll need more than just beef. Dairy products would fetch good prices, especially hard cheeses that travel well. The Prescott brothers exchanged glances. Never thought about that, James admitted. It's worth considering. Hannah's voice grew more confident. One good milk cow can produce enough for several pounds of cheese weekly with minimal investment. The process of making cheddar cheese begins right after milking, Hannah explained, her hands drawing on the table as if illustrating. The milk must be cultured with cheese starter at the exact right temperature. Too hot will kill the culture, too cold will slow the process. My grandfather always checked with his elbow. When it felt as warm as a baby's skin, that was the perfect temperature. Ethan listened, surprised by her in-depth knowledge. After curdling, the curd mass needs to be cut into small blocks to separate the whey, she continued, then pressed and stacked, turning them consistently every 15 minutes. This is the most crucial step. The cheddaring process creates the distinctive texture. I had no idea cheese making was so complex, Ethan admitted. Hannah smiled. That's only the beginning. Afterward, you must mill it fine, salt it, press it into oak molds, and age it in a cool room from 3 to 12 months. 3-month cheese is mild, suitable for daily consumption. But year-old cheese, her eyes brightened, is sharp and complex and can sell for 3 times the price in major cities. She sketched a simple diagram of the necessary aging room with pine shelves, ventilation system, and stone sink for cleaning equipment. With 10 good milk cows, we could produce about 100 pounds of cheese monthly, enough to supply the railroad workers and still have surplus to sell to merchants in Helena. Ethan watched this exchange with growing interest. Hannah had never mentioned such knowledge before, yet she spoke with clear expertise. The Prescotts were listening attentively, their initial surprise at her appearance long forgotten in the face of her practical intelligence. After the Prescotts departed with promises of further discussions, Ethan found Hannah in the garden again, working as if the interruption had never occurred. You never mentioned knowing about commercial dairy production, he said, leaning against the fence post. Hannah continued hoeing. You never asked. I'm asking now. She paused, wiping her hands on her apron. My mother's family were cheesemakers in Vermont. I spent summers there as a girl learning the process. It's fairly simple, but requires attention to detail. Ethan considered this new information. You think it could be profitable here? With the railroad coming? Unquestionably. Hannah looked up, meeting his gaze directly. 20 dairy cows producing cheese could generate more stable income than twice that number of beef cattle, with less land required. The initial investment would be offset within a year. The businesslike assessment was delivered with such confidence that Ethan found himself nodding. Moses mentioned there's an old milking shed behind the north pasture. Rebecca's father kept dairy cows years ago, but after he died, he trailed off, realizing he had once again introduced Rebecca into the conversation. But Hannah showed no discomfort at the mention. "Would you show me?" she asked. "If it's still structurally sound, renovation would be more practical than new construction." The abandoned milking shed was in better condition than Ethan had expected. The roof needed repair, and the interior was thick with dust and cobwebs, but the basic structure remained solid. Hannah examined it with the same clinical efficiency she had first applied to his house, assessing possibilities rather than current condition. "It would need a proper milk room with stone counters for cooling," she mused, moving through the space, "and ventilation improved for the cheese aging. But the bones are good." Ethan watched her, struck by how naturally she had assumed the role of planning their future. Not just maintaining what existed, but building something new, something that could outlast Hardy's immediate threat. "You're thinking beyond 6 months," he observed. Hannah turned, the afternoon light catching her face. For once, she didn't adjust her position to hide the scarred side. "Should I not?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Their arrangement had been predicated on immediate necessity, not long-term vision. Yet here she stood, planning improvements that would take seasons to fully realize. "No," Ethan said finally. "It's good thinking. Forward thinking." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "My father also said never solve one problem without considering the next three waiting behind it." "Your father sounds like a man I would have respected." He was. Sadness flickered briefly in her eyes. The war took him, Antietam. One afternoon, Hannah wandered farther than usual, following a trail up to the eastern hilltop of the ranch. From there, the entire valley spread beneath her feet like a living painting. The late afternoon sun gilded the grasslands, the creek winding like a silver ribbon, and the ranch house standing steadfast amid the wild landscape. Hannah sat down on a boulder, allowing herself to breathe deeply the clean air. This place was worlds apart from Boston. No judging eyes, no whispers behind her back. Here, her scars seemed no longer the most noteworthy thing about here. This land didn't care about appearances. It only responded to care and hard work. For the first time in many years, Hannah felt a strange sensation, a sense of belonging. Not because she was Ethan's wife on paper, but because this valley seemed to accept her, with all her wounds and imperfections, not demanding she be someone else. Her eyes moistened as she looked down at the distant house, which gradually she was calling home. When she returned, she brought a bouquet of wildflowers to place in a jar on the kitchen table, a small sign that she was no longer merely a temporary resident, but someone putting down roots. The simple statement carried volumes of unspoken grief. Ethan nodded, understanding without need for elaboration. The war had taken from everyone, in different ways but with the same finality. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "Is am I for your Rebecca?" Hannah's voice was gentle but direct. "Loss shapes us, Mr. Blackwood, but it needn't define us." Something in her words resonated deeply with Ethan. They were not empty consolations, but the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had faced her own griefs. Someone who carried visible reminders of that pain every day, yet continued forward. Before he could respond, Moses appeared in the doorway. "Ethan, rider coming fast. Looks like trouble." Ethan moved quickly to the door, squinting against the late afternoon sun. A single horseman was galloping up the valley road, pushing his mount hard. As he drew closer, Ethan recognized Charlie Wilson, the 17-year-old son of Judge Wilson from Clearwater. "Mr. Blackwood," the boy called, reining his lathered horse to a skidding stop. "Pa sent me, said you needed warning." "Catch your breath, son," Ethan said, taking the horse's bridle to steady the nervous animal. "What's happened?" Charlie wiped sweat from his face. "Hardy filed foreclosure papers this morning. Claims your loan's in default due to missed interest payment." "What?" Ethan's voice hardened. "Payment's not due until end of month. Pa says Hardy altered the terms when he bought the note. Made it look like you missed a payment in February." "That's fraud." Charlie nodded vigorously. "Pa knows it, but as judge, he can't interfere directly. Told me to ride out and warn you that Hardy's sending men tomorrow with papers." Ethan felt cold anger settling in his chest. Your father's a good man, Charlie. Thank him for me. He turned to Moses. Get the boy some water and see to his horse. As Moses led Charlie toward the well, Ethan turned to Hannah. Her face had gone pale, but her expression remained composed. What will you do? She asked quietly. Ride to Clearwater tonight. Speak to Judge Wilson directly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Hardy thinks he can steal this land through legal trickery. He's wrong. Hannah nodded. I'll prepare food for your journey. Her practical response steadied him. No hysterics, no useless questions, just immediate adaptation to the changed circumstances. Ethan found himself unexpectedly grateful for her calm efficiency. As dusk gathered, Ethan prepared for the night ride to Clearwater. Hannah packed cold biscuits, jerky, and a flask of coffee in his saddlebags, moving with quiet purpose. When all was ready, she handed him his oilskin coat, anticipating the night chill that would settle in the valley. Be careful, she said simply. Hardy wouldn't have acted unless he believed he could succeed. I know. Ethan checked his Winchester one last time. Moses will stay close to the house. If anyone but me approaches, don't open the door. Hannah's eyes hardened slightly. I can defend what's mine, Mr. Blackwood. The possessive pronoun caught Ethan's attention, but there was no time to examine it. With a final nod, he mounted his horse and rode into the gathering darkness. The 12 miles to Clearwater stretched longer at night. Ethan pushed his horse as fast as he dared on the uneven trail, guided by moonlight and intimate knowledge of the land. His mind raced ahead to Clearwater, to Judge Wilson and the legal trap Hardy had set. Judge Wilson's home sat at the edge of town, a sturdy two-story structure that doubled as his private law office. Despite the late hour, lights still burned in the front room. Ethan tethered his horse and approached the door, aware of the unusual nature of his visit. The judge himself answered, a tall man with iron-gray hair and penetrating eyes. Blackwood, he said without surprise. Charlie found you then. He did. Ethan removed his hat as he stepped inside. I appreciate the warning. Wilson nodded grimly. Least I could do. Hardy's overreached this time. Altering legal documents is a serious offense. Can you stop the foreclosure? The judge sighed, gesturing Ethan toward a chair. Not directly. The documents appear correct on their face. Without proof of alteration, the law must proceed as written. So he gets away with it. Ethan remained standing, too tense to sit. I didn't say that. Wilson moved to his desk, removing several papers from a drawer. Hardy's been acquiring debts throughout the county. Yours isn't the first he's manipulated. I've been gathering evidence, quietly. He spread the papers before Ethan. Land records, loan agreements, foreclosure notices. A pattern is emerging, but building a legal case takes time. Time I don't have, Ethan said flatly. Wilson nodded. Hence my warning. You need to protect yourself legally while I continue my investigation. He picked up a pen, jotting notes on a fresh sheet of paper. First, don't accept service of any documents without witnesses present. Second, file a formal objection into the claim default. Third, and most important, secure alternative financing, if possible. The judge looked up, his expression grave. Hardy has friends at the Territorial Bank, but there are other options. The Cattlemen's Association in Helena has established a fund for situations like yours. With your service record and standing, you'd likely qualify. I'd have to travel to Helena. That's 3 days each way. Yes. Wilson's gaze was steady, and you'd need to leave immediately. Before Hardy's men arrived with those papers, Ethan absorbed this, calculating quickly. 6 days minimum for the journey, leaving Hannah and Moses to face Hardy's men alone. The thought sat uneasily in his stomach. There's one more thing you should know, Wilson said, his voice lowering. Hardy's been asking questions about your wife, her background, her time as a nurse during the war. I don't know what he's after, but he's digging. Cold anger flared in Ethan's chest. Hannah's past is her own business. I agree, but Hardy clearly thinks there's something there he can use. Wilson leaned forward. Blackwood, I've known you since you came to this territory. You're a good man, but Hardy plays by different rules. He wants that land, and he'll use any means to get it. Ethan left the judge's house with a clear plan, but a troubled mind. The night had deepened, the town of Clearwater fallen silent, except for distant piano notes drifting from the saloon. He remounted his horse, but instead of heading directly back to the ranch, he rode to the telegraph office. The operator was closing up, but at the sight of Ethan's grim expression, he reluctantly reopened his door. 20 minutes later, 3 telegrams were on their way. One to the Cattlemen's Association in Helena, one to a former Army comrade now working for the territorial government, and one to a banking connection in Denver. Contingencies. Options. Ethan had learned in war never to fight on a single front. It was well past midnight when he finally turned his horse toward home. The moon had set, leaving the trail in darkness broken only by starlight. The journey back was slower, his mind heavy with the weight of decisions that couldn't wait until morning. Hannah was waiting on the porch when he arrived, a rifle balanced across her lap, her figure a pale silhouette against the darker house. She stood as he dismounted, setting the rifle aside. "You should be sleeping," Ethan said, leading his tired horse toward the barn. "As should you." Hannah fell into step beside him. "What did Judge Wilson say?" Ethan briefed her as they walked, outlining Wilson's advice and his own plans. Hannah listened without interruption, her expression thoughtful in the dim light of the barn lantern as Ethan unsaddled his horse. "So you'll leave for Helena tomorrow," she said when he had finished. Not a question, but a conclusion. First light. Ethan began brushing down his mount, the rhythmic strokes calming his mind. "Moses knows the ranch routine. You'll manage the house. And if Hardy's men come with those papers, don't accept them. Don't sign anything." Ethan's voice hardened. "This is legally your home now too, Hannah. You have every right to refuse entry to anyone." She nodded, absorbing this. "I'll need your Winchester. My father's shotgun is effective but limited in range." On the practical request, delivered without drama or fear, reminded Ethan again of how different Hannah was from most women of his acquaintance. She didn't ask if Hardy's men would be dangerous. She simply prepared for the possibility with the same efficiency she applied to household management. "Of course," Ethan hesitated, then added, "Wilson mentioned something else. Hardy's been asking questions about your past, your time as a nurse." In the lantern light, he saw Hannah's face go very still. "What sort of questions?" He didn't specify, just that Hardy was digging. Ethan studied her reaction. "Is there something I should know? Something Hardy might try to use?" Hannah's gaze dropped to her hands, which had tightened into fists at her sides. For a long moment she was silent, and Ethan thought she might refuse to answer. Then she looked up, her expression carefully controlled. "During the war at Petersburg, when the shell hit the hospital," she paused, drawing a deep breath, "I made a choice. The medical supplies were burning. Patients were trapped. I could reach some, not all." Ethan waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "I saved a colonel first. He was nearest, yes, but also highest ranking." Her voice had gone flat, clinical. "3 enlisted men died while I was getting him out. Men who might have lived if I'd reached them first." Understanding dawned. "You blame yourself." The Army investigated, ruled it proper triage under battlefield conditions. Hannah's laugh held no humor. Very official language for leaving men to burn while saving an officer. "You couldn't save everyone." "No, but my choice of who to save first." She met his eyes directly. "The colonel was conscious. The enlisted men were sedated after surgeries. I rationalized that he could help with evacuations once freed. But the truth is, I saw the insignia on his uniform and made a calculation." The confession hung in the air between them. Ethan recognized the burden she carried, understood its weight. In war, men made such choices constantly. Who to save, who to leave, who to shoot, who to spare. The moral mathematics of survival rarely balanced neatly. "There was a witness," Hannah continued, "a chaplain who questioned my decision afterward. He was quite vocal about it, wrote letters to his superiors. Nothing came of the official inquiry, but the accusations followed me. It's why I left nursing after the war." Ethan considered this information carefully. "If Hardy knows this story, he could use it to damage my reputation. And yours by association." Hannah's voice was steady again. "In a small community like Clearwater, such accusations could be powerful." Ethan set down the brush, turning to face her fully. "Hannah, every soldier who survived that war lives with choices made in moments of terror. choices that seem clear in the moment and haunt us after. He stepped closer. I don't judge you for saving who you could, and I won't let Hardy use your past against you. Something in her expression softened slightly. Thank you for that, but Hardy will use whatever weapons he can find. Then we'll be ready. Ethan surprised himself with the fierceness of his response. This is our home, our land. We'll defend it together. The plural pronouns felt natural now, no longer a legal fiction, but a statement of shared purpose. Hannah nodded once, her shoulders straightening almost imperceptibly. Get some rest, she said. You have a long journey tomorrow. Ethan watched her walk back to the house, her straight back and measured steps revealing nothing of the vulnerability she had just shown him. In the few weeks since her arrival, Hannah Sullivan Blackwood had become a fortress unto herself, protecting her wounds behind walls of efficiency and practicality. Yet tonight she had lowered those walls enough to share her darkest memory. The trust implicit in that act was not lost on him. Dawn found Ethan already prepared for travel, his saddlebags packed with provisions for the journey to Helena. Hannah had risen even earlier, preparing a substantial breakfast and additional food for the trail. They ate quickly, the kitchen filled with the practical discussion of ranch matters that would require attention during his absence. Moses will check the north pasture fence today, Ethan said, folding a map and tucking it into his shirt pocket. The new calves need watching. 2 are still weak. Hannah nodded. I've prepared willow bark tea for the bay mare. Her leg is healing, but the inflammation persists. The domesticity of the exchange struck Ethan suddenly. The easy sharing of responsibilities. The assumption of continuity. In just weeks, they had developed the rhythms of a long-established partnership. Moses joined them as Ethan prepared to mount up, bringing last-minute reports on overnight developments. No sign of Hardy's men yet, but the old man had spotted unknown riders near the valley entrance the previous evening. Keep the shotgun loaded, Ethan told him quietly, adjusting his saddle cinch, and watch the south approach. They'll likely come that way, following the creek. Moses nodded grimly. We'll manage. You just get that loan secured. Hannah stood on the porch, watching these preparations with composed stillness. When Ethan approached to say his final goodbye, she handed him a small leather pouch. Willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection, comfrey for wounds, she said matter-of-factly. The brewing instructions are inside. Mountain travel can be unpredictable. The practical gift, so characteristic of Hannah's thoughtfulness, caught Ethan off guard. Thank you, he said, tucking the pouch into his saddlebag. Then, acting on impulse, he reached for her hand. I'll return as quickly as possible. Hannah's fingers tightened briefly around his. We'll be here. The simple promise carried more weight than elaborate reassurances might have. Ethan mounted his horse, tipped his hat once to Hannah and Moses, and rode toward the valley entrance. He did not look back, but he carried the image of Hannah standing straight-backed on the porch, facing whatever might come with quiet determination. The journey to Helena followed familiar trails through increasingly mountainous terrain. Ethan pushed himself and his horse as hard as safety allowed, stopping only when absolutely necessary. The spring weather held, the trails mostly dry, allowing good progress. On the evening of the second day, camping beneath towering pines, Ethan found himself thinking of Hannah more than the legal battle awaiting him in Helena. How would she handle Hardy's men if they came? Would she stand her ground or seek to diffuse the situation diplomatically? The woman he had first met would likely have chosen cool reserve and strategic retreat. But the woman who had waded into a flooding creek to save a frightened heifer, who had faced down townspeople's stares and Hardy's insinuations, that woman might surprise everyone. The thought brought an unexpected smile to his face. Hannah Sullivan Blackwood was not a woman easily categorized or predicted. Perhaps that was why she had begun to occupy his thoughts with increasing frequency. Helena appeared on the horizon late on the third day, its buildings clustered in the mountain valley like pieces on a chessboard. The territorial capital had grown substantially since Ethan's last visit, new construction evident along the main streets. The bustle of commerce and politics giving the town an energy Clearwater lacked. Ethan made his way directly to the Cattlemen's Association offices, a solid brick building near the courthouse. Inside, he found himself navigating the unfamiliar terrain of financial negotiation. The association representatives were cordial but cautious, reviewing his ranch assets, production records, and the complicated legal situation with Hardy. This foreclosure action appears irregular, said Henderson, the association's legal advisor, examining the papers Ethan had brought. Judge Wilson's concerns seem well-founded. However, our ability to intervene is limited by our charter. Meaning? Ethan asked, fatigue making his voice sharper than intended. Meaning we can offer a bridge loan of $500 secured by your spring calves, Henderson replied evenly. Not the full $1,200 you require, but perhaps enough to forestall immediate action while Judge Wilson builds his case. Ethan calculated quickly. $500 from the association, perhaps $400 from the cattle sale with the Prescotts, still $300 short, but closer than he had been yesterday. When can the funds be available? Tomorrow morning. The paperwork will take several hours to process. Henderson leaned forward. Mr. Blackwood, one more thing. This Jackson Hardy, he's become known to financial circles in Helena. His methods have raised concerns with the Territorial Banking Commission. There may be an investigation forthcoming. That won't help me if he takes my ranch next week. Henderson nodded soberly. Precisely why we're willing to extend the bridge loan despite the risks. Men like Hardy need to be checked before they acquire too much power. Ethan left the association offices with mixed emotions. The loan would help, but it wasn't the complete solution he had hoped for. He still needed to secure the remaining funds somehow. As night fell over Helena, Ethan made his way to the telegraph office, hoping for responses to his earlier messages. The clerk handed him 2 yellow slips. The first, from his Army comrade, offered sympathy but no concrete assistance. The second, from his banking contact in Denver, was more promising. Could arrange additional funds, stop, require personal meeting, Denver, stop arriving Clearwater next Wednesday, business trip stop. Ethan read the message twice. Wednesday was 5 days away, too long to wait if Hardy's men were already moving against the ranch. Yet the prospect of additional funding couldn't be ignored. He composed a reply. We'll meet Wednesday, Clearwater Hotel. Stop situation, urgent stop. With that sent, Ethan secured a room at a modest boarding house and fell into an exhausted sleep. Morning would bring the association funds, and with them, the beginning of his journey home. To the ranch, to Hannah. The third day of Ethan's absence dawned clear and cool at Blackwood Ranch. Hannah rose at first light, moving through the quiet house with practiced efficiency. The previous 2 days had passed without incident, but the sense of watchful waiting had grown heavier with each passing hour. She was feeding the chickens when Moses appeared from the direction of the creek, moving faster than his usual pace. Riders, he said without preamble. 4 of them, coming up the south trail. Hannah straightened, brushing feed from her apron. Hardy's men? Looks like. Moses's weathered face was grim. Recognized Jackson Hardy himself in the lead, and that hired gun of his, Mercer. Hannah nodded calmly, though her pulse had quickened. How long? 20 minutes, maybe less. Time enough. She handed the feed pail to Moses. Finish with the chickens. I'll prepare inside. The old man looked like he might object, then nodded sharply. Don't let them push you, Mrs. Blackwood. This is your home now, too. The simple acknowledgement strengthened her resolve. Hannah moved quickly to the house, her mind already formulating a strategy. Judge Wilson's advice had been clear. Don't accept service. Don't sign anything. But beyond that, she would need to rely on her own judgment. Inside, she changed quickly from her work dress to her best black dress, the one she had worn to town. Not out of vanity, but strategy. She would meet Hardy not as a farm woman, caught unaware, but as the lady of the house, composed and dignified. The psychological advantage might be small, but she would take every edge available. Next, she loaded Ethan's Winchester and positioned it just inside the front door, out of sight but within easy reach. The shotgun she placed in the kitchen, covering the back entrance. Weapons were a last resort, but she had not survived a war without learning preparedness. Finally, she put coffee on to boil. A social nicety, yes, but also a subtle assertion of control. Hardy would arrive expecting to intimidate. She would receive him as any proper hostess might receive unwelcome but unavoidable guests. The sound of approaching horses reached her just as she was arranging cups on the kitchen table. Hannah took a deep breath, smoothed her dress, and moved to the front door. Standing on the porch, she watched as 4 riders approached the house. Jackson Hardy led the group, impeccably dressed despite the trail dust. Beside him rode a lean man with cold eyes whom Hannah assumed was Mercer. Behind them came two others, nondescript in the way of hired men everywhere. All four carried sidearms visible at their hips. Hardy reined his horse to a stop before the porch, false surprise registering on his face. "Mrs. Blackwood, I expected your husband to be present." "Mr. Hardy," Hannah acknowledged him with a slight nod. "Mr. Blackwood is away on business. I manage the ranch in his absence." Hardy dismounted, handing his reins to one of the men. "Most unfortunate, I have legal matters to discuss that require his immediate attention. Any communication for my husband can be left with me." Hannah remained on the porch, maintaining the higher ground both literally and figuratively. Hardy smiled thinly. "I'm afraid this is rather more complicated. A formal service of foreclosure documents requires direct contact with the property owner." "I am a property owner, Mr. Hardy." Hannah's voice remained level. "This ranch belongs to both Mr. Blackwood and myself under Montana territory law." The banker's expression flickered briefly. He hadn't expected legal knowledge from a woman, particularly one he had dismissed as a disfigured mail-order bride. Hannah allowed herself a moment of satisfaction at having disrupted his script. "Nevertheless," Hardy continued, recovering, "the debt was contracted by Mr. Blackwood in a loan before your arrangement. The foreclosure proceeds against him specifically." Hannah raised an eyebrow. "Then it seems you have a procedural problem, Mr. Hardy. You cannot serve documents on someone who isn't present." Anger flashed across Hardy's face, quickly suppressed. "Mrs. Blackwood, I advise you not to obstruct legal proceedings. It could go poorly for you both." Moses had approached silently from the barn, the shotgun held casually at his side. "Threatening a lady on her own property, Hardy? That ain't legal proceedings in any court I know." Hardy glanced between them, calculating. Hannah could almost see the adjustment of tactics behind his eyes. No threats intended, merely advice. His tone softened to something almost reasonable. "Mrs. Blackwood, perhaps we could discuss this situation more comfortably. May I come inside?" "I think not." Hannah gestured to the porch chairs instead. "But you're welcome to rest here before your return journey. Coffee is available." The redirection was subtle but clear. Hardy would not be entering their home, but neither was Hannah creating unnecessary confrontation. The banker hesitated, then nodded stiffly and mounted the porch steps. As they settled into the chairs, Hannah maintaining a careful distance, she noticed Mercer positioning himself where he could watch both the house entrance and Moses. The man's hand never strayed far from his holstered pistol. A professional then, not merely a hired bully. "Mrs. Blackwood," Hardy began, accepting the coffee she poured with a mechanical politeness. "I understand your loyalty to your husband. It's commendable, but you should know the full situation before tying your future to his sinking prospects." Hannah sipped her own coffee, waiting. "Ethan Blackwood is not merely in debt. He's been systematically mismanaging this ranch for years, since his first wife's death. The loan was merely the latest in a series of financial missteps." Hardy leaned forward. "This property is worth far more than his remaining equity. By fighting the inevitable foreclosure, he's only reducing what you both might salvage." "Is that your professional assessment as a banker, Mr. Hardy?" Hannah asked coolly. "Or as the man who stands to profit most from acquiring this land before the railroad arrives?" Hardy's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're quite direct for a lady, and you're quite transparent for a businessman." Hannah set her cup down precisely. "Let me be equally transparent, Mr. Hardy. My husband has gone to Helena to secure alternative financing. Judge Wilson is aware of certain irregularities in your acquisition and handling of the loan documents, and I have no intention of leaving this property now or in the future." The blunt assessment seemed to catch Hardy off guard. He studied Hannah with new calculation, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. "You're an unusual woman, Mrs. Blackwood. Your history suggests as much." The deliberate reference to her past sent a chill through Hannah, though she maintained her composed expression. "My history is irrelevant to the matter at hand." "Is it?" Hardy set his coffee aside. "A nurse with a controversial war record. A woman who fled Boston after certain accusations regarding patient care decisions. A convenient marriage to a financially desperate rancher." He smiled coldly. "History shapes perception, Mrs. Blackwood, and perception matters greatly in small communities like Clearwater. The threat was unmistakable. Hannah felt anger rising but kept her voice steady. If you're attempting to intimidate me with vague insinuations about my past, Mr. Hardy, you're wasting both our time. Not intimidation, merely a reminder that we all have vulnerabilities. Hardy rose, brushing invisible dust from his immaculate coat. When your husband returns, inform him that he has 3 days to present full payment or the formal foreclosure proceedings will begin. Judge Wilson's personal feelings notwithstanding, the law is quite clear on defaulted loans. Hannah stood as well, unwilling to remain seated while Hardy loomed over her. The law is indeed clear, Mr. Hardy, on proper loan documentation, on fraudulent alterations of terms, and on the rights of property owners. Judge Wilson understands this very well. Something dangerous flickered in Hardy's eyes. You play a risky game for someone with so much to lose, Mrs. Blackwood. I lost everything once before, Mr. Hardy. Hannah met his gaze unflinchingly. It taught me the difference between what matters and what doesn't. This land matters. Your threats do not. Hardy studied her for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as if coming to a decision. 3 days, he repeated, turning toward the steps. Mercer will return on Thursday if I haven't heard from your husband. Hannah watched as the men remounted and rode away, maintaining her straight-backed posture until they disappeared around the bend in the valley road. Only then did she allow herself to exhale fully, the tension she had controlled finally manifesting in slightly trembling hands. Moses approached, resting the shotgun against the porch railing. You handled that well, Mrs. Blackwood. Perhaps, Hannah gathered the coffee cups, needing the simple task to center herself. Or perhaps I've made things worse by challenging him directly. Men like Hardy only understand direct challenges. Moses spat toward the departing rider's dust. You showed him you ain't easily frightened. That matters. Hannah nodded, appreciating the old man's support. He knows about Petersburg, about what happened there. Figured as much from what he was hinting at. Moses's weathered face creased with concern. You told Ethan about that? Yes. The simple admission felt significant somehow. Before he left. Good, Moses nodded approvingly. No secrets between married folk. Makes for stronger ground when trouble comes. The casual designation of their arrangement as a true marriage might once have prompted correction. Now Hannah let it stand. Whatever legal fiction had initiated their partnership, the reality had evolved into something neither of them had anticipated, something that felt increasingly genuine despite its practical foundations. Thursday, she said thoughtfully. Ethan should be back by then, if all went well in Helena. And if it didn't? Moses asked quietly. Hannah straightened her shoulders, decision crystallizing. Then I'll handle Mercer myself. The Montana sky stretched endless and blue as Ethan Blackwood rode the final miles toward home. 4 days of hard travel from Helena had left him dust-covered and weary, but determined. The leather satchel secured inside his coat carried bank drafts totaling $800, the Cattlemen's Association loan, and an advance payment from the Prescott brothers for the cattle deal. Not the full $1,200 Hardy demanded, but enough to buy time and negotiate from strength. As the familiar contours of Blackwood Valley came into view, Ethan felt the tension in his shoulders ease slightly. No smoke rose from unwanted fires. No signs of disturbance marked the landscape. The ranch appeared peaceful in the late afternoon light. He urged his tired horse forward, eyes scanning for movement. Hannah would have posted Moses's as lookout after Hardy's visit, assuming Hardy had come as expected. The thought of Hannah facing that man alone had gnawed at Ethan throughout his journey, driving him to push harder, sleep less. A rifle shot cracked across the valley, a single report that echoed off the ridge. Ethan stiffened, then relaxed as he recognized the pattern. 1 shot, pause, 2 shots in quick succession. Moses's all-clear signal established years ago, not danger, but recognition. Minutes later, Moses appeared on the ridge trail, rifle resting easily across his saddle. The old man raised a hand in greeting as he rode to intercept Ethan. Good timing, Moses called, falling in beside him. Hardy's man Mercer is due tomorrow. Hannah? Handling things. Woman's got steel in her spine. Pride colored the old man's voice. Hardy came 3 days back. 4 riders, all armed. Thought they'd intimidate her into signing something. Ethan's jaw tightened. And Moses grinned, tobacco-stained teeth showing beneath his gray mustache. She offered them coffee on the porch, cool as December, wouldn't let them inside, laid out the law better than any circuit judge I've heard, even called Hardy on his tampering with the loan papers. Relief mingled with something like pride in Ethan's chest. He'd gambled, leaving Hannah to face Hardy, trusting her strength. By Moses's account, she'd proven more formidable than even he had anticipated. Any trouble after they left? Moses shook his head. Quiet, too quiet maybe. Hannah's kept the Winchester loaded and close. Slept in the main room 2 nights, watching the approach. He paused. She never complained, never showed fear, but she ain't slept proper since you left. They crested the final rise, overlooking the ranch house. Ethan saw a figure emerge onto the porch. Hannah, her dark dress visible against the weathered wood. She stood straight-backed, watching their approach, one hand shading her eyes against the western sun. Get yourself cleaned up, Moses said gruffly, reining his horse toward the barn. Woman's been waiting long enough. Ethan nodded, suddenly conscious of his trail-worn appearance. 4 days of hard riding had left him dusty and stubbled, his clothes stiff with dried sweat. Yet Hannah was walking toward him now, crossing the yard with measured steps, and there was no time to remedy his condition. He dismounted as she approached, removing his hat. Hannah. Ethan. Her formal use of his first name registered immediately. Since when had she abandoned the careful Mr. Blackwood she had maintained since her arrival? The shift felt significant. You're well? He asked, searching her face for signs of strain. Yes. Hannah's gaze moved over him, assessing. You're exhausted. There's hot water for washing, and food ready whenever you want it. The practical care behind these simple statements touched Ethan unexpectedly. Thank you. He hesitated, then reached into his coat, withdrawing the leather satchel. I secured $800, not the full amount, but enough to negotiate. Hannah's expression lightened. That's good news. The Prescotts sent word yesterday. They've agreed to the full price on the cattle deal, another $400 by month's end. Ethan calculated quickly. $1,200 total. Exactly what we need. Yes. A ghost of a smile touched Hannah's lips. Though I suspect Hardy will discover some additional fee or interest to increase the amount due. Likely. Ethan handed his horse's reins to a waiting stable boy, one of the Prescott hands sent to help during his absence. Moses says Hardy threatened you. Something flickered in Hannah's eyes. He tried. He knows about Petersburg, implied he would use it against us in Clearwater. Us, Ethan noted. Not me or you, but us. The subtle shift in pronouns reflected a deeper change in their arrangement. What had begun as a practical transaction had transformed, gradually but undeniably, into a true partnership. I need to wash, he said, suddenly aware of the gulf between his trail-worn state and her composed appearance. Then we'll talk. Plan our next move. Hannah nodded. I've prepared the bath in the back room, and your clean clothes are laid out. Again, the simple domestic thoughtfulness struck Ethan with unexpected force. This wasn't mere housekeeping. This was personal care, consideration for his comfort after a difficult journey. Inside the house, Ethan found everything exactly as Hannah had indicated. The bath steamed invitingly, the water scented lightly with pine, a small luxury he hadn't expected. Clean clothes waited on the bed, his best shirt pressed smooth. The whole house hummed with Hannah's efficient presence, from the organized desk where ranch accounts lay neatly stacked to the fresh wildflowers in a simple jar on the kitchen table. Later, bathed and dressed in clean clothes, Ethan joined Hannah in the kitchen. She had prepared a substantial meal, venison stew, fresh bread, early spring greens from her garden. They ate with the comfortable silence of people accustomed to each other's presence, broken occasionally by practical questions about his journey or the ranch's status. Only when the meal was finished did Hannah broach the subject of Hardy. Mercer will come tomorrow. Hardy was explicit about the deadline. Ethan nodded, sipping the coffee she'd poured. Let him come. We have funds to address the loan, legitimate funds with proper documentation. Hardy's manipulation of the terms won't stand against that. Hannah studied him across the table, her gray eyes thoughtful. There's more to it now. Hardy wants the land, not repayment. The railroad survey team confirmed the route last week, directly through the north corner of Blackwood property. How do you know this? Dr. Wilson, the judge's brother, he came to check on Moses's arthritis 2 days ago, brought news from town. Hannah's expression remained composed, but Ethan detected underlying tension in her voice. Hardy stands to make thousands if he controls this land when the railroad purchases right-of-way access. Ethan absorbed this information, fitting it into the larger pattern of Hardy's actions. That explains his urgency and his willingness to bend the law. Yes, Hannah hesitated, then added quietly, "There's something else you should know. Something I discovered while you were gone." The subtle shift in her tone alerted Ethan. "Go on." "I went through Rebecca's old papers in the attic, looking for anything that might help with the loan situation." Hannah's hands clasped together on the table. "I found letters between Rebecca and her father discussing the land trust." Ethan frowned. "What about it?" "The terms are more specific than you described. If the property passes from Blackwood ownership, a portion, 40 acres along the creek, reverts to the church in Clearwater." Hannah met his eyes directly. The very 40 acres the railroad needs for access. Ethan stared at her, understanding dawning. "Hardy doesn't know." "No, it appears to be a private clause never publicly recorded, just family correspondence." Hannah's expression was carefully neutral. Rebecca's father was evidently concerned about outside speculators. He wanted to ensure the land served the community if it ever left family hands. The strategic implication was clear. If Hardy gained control of the property through foreclosure, he would discover too late that the most valuable portion, the very reason for his interest, was beyond his reach. The railroad would have to negotiate with the church, not Hardy, for right-of-way access. "This changes everything," Ethan said slowly. "Hardy's risking legal impropriety for land that won't serve his purpose." "Yes," Hannah's voice remained measured, "though he doesn't know that yet." Ethan studied her face, reading the calculation behind her composed expression. "You're suggesting we use this information." "Information is power, Ethan, especially when dealing with men like Hardy." Hannah leaned forward slightly. "We need every advantage in this fight." The "we" registered again, cementing what Ethan had already begun to understand. Hannah had fully committed herself to this land, this home, this partnership. What had begun as a marriage of convenience had evolved into something far more substantial, a true alliance founded on shared purpose and growing respect. "You're right," he said finally. "Tomorrow, when Mercer comes, we'll be ready, with the funds and with this knowledge." Hannah nodded, satisfaction briefly lighting her eyes. They spent the next hour planning strategy, discussing contingencies, preparing for various outcomes of the coming confrontation. Throughout, Ethan found himself increasingly aware of the natural rhythm of their collaboration. Hannah's mind was sharp, her insights practical, her determination matching his own. As night fell, they moved to the porch by unspoken agreement. The evening air carried the scent of pine and wildflowers, the first stars appearing in the deepening blue above. They sat in companionable silence, the day's tensions gradually easing. "I read your father's letters too," Hannah said finally. "The ones from Pennsylvania. He seemed like a good man." Ethan nodded, surprised but not displeased by her initiative. "He was, tough but fair, taught me everything I know about this land." "He wrote about your mother beautifully. Even years after her death, his grief remained dignified somehow." Hannah's voice softened. "You have that quality too, carrying loss without being consumed by it." The observation, so personal and perceptive, caught Ethan off guard. "I wouldn't have said so. After Rebecca died, I nearly lost myself." "But you didn't." Hannah turned slightly toward him, her profile outlined against the darkening sky. "You continued, built this ranch, maintained what mattered." "Perhaps." Ethan found himself studying the scarred side of her face, no longer seeing deformity but character, visible evidence of survival and strength. "You understand something about carrying visible wounds, I think." Hannah's hand rose unconsciously to her cheek, fingers tracing the familiar ridges of scar tissue. "Yes, though I've learned scars are not always burdens. Sometimes they're proof of what we can endure." Something shifted between them in that moment, a deepening connection. an acknowledgement of shared understanding. They had both been marked by life, shaped by loss and pain. Yet here they sat, on land they both cherished, facing common challenges with united purpose. When Hannah finally rose to retire for the night, Ethan found himself reluctant to end their conversation. "Tomorrow will be difficult," he said, standing as well. "Yes." Hannah paused at the door, the lamplight from inside illuminating half her face in warm gold. "But we'll face it together." The simple statement carried weight far beyond its words. Ethan watched her disappear inside, feeling a curious lightness despite the challenges awaiting them. Whatever came tomorrow, they would meet it as true partners, perhaps for the first time since her arrival. Dawn arrived with its promise of heat, the sun climbing into a cloudless sky. Ethan woke early, finding Hannah already dressed and in the kitchen, preparing breakfast with her usual efficiency. They ate quickly, reviewing their strategy one final time. "If Mercer brings formal papers, I'll handle the legal response," Hannah said, pouring coffee. "The funds should speak for themselves, but I've prepared a written objection to Hardy's manipulation of the terms." Ethan nodded, impressed again by her thoroughness. "And if he brings more than papers?" Hannah's expression hardened slightly. "Moses has positioned himself in the north barn with a clear view of the approach. I have the Winchester. You have your sidearm." She met his eyes directly. "We're prepared for any reasonable scenario." The calm assessment of potential violence, delivered without drama or fear, reminded Ethan again of how different Hannah was from most women of his acquaintance. Her experiences as a war nurse had clearly tempered any delicate sensibilities society might have expected her to maintain. "Let's hope it doesn't come to that," Ethan said, finishing his coffee. "Hardy's a businessman first. When faced with legitimate funds and potential legal complications, he should retreat to safer ground." Hannah's slight smile held little warmth. Men rarely retreat easily from what they believe they're entitled to. But yes, let's hope. They waited on the porch, the morning advancing toward noon with no sign of visitors. Ethan found himself growing increasingly tense, checking his pocket watch repeatedly. Hannah, by contrast, maintained her composed exterior, though Ethan noticed her eyes scanning the horizon with regular precision. Hardy and Mercer arrived differently than before, this time with a more cautious demeanor. Hardy no longer stepped onto the porch with arrogance, but stood in the yard, his eyes making a tense assessment. "Blackwood, we have matters to settle," Hardy said, his tone more formal. "I trust your wife informed you about the deadline." Ethan didn't invite them into the house or onto the porch as Hannah had done. Instead, he descended to meet Hardy on level ground, eliminating the height advantage that Hannah had maintained during the previous confrontation. "We're fully prepared," Ethan said, his voice steady, both financially and legally. Mercer and the others maintained their distance, hands near their guns, but not directly threatening. Hannah stood on the porch, the Winchester within reach, but not in her hands, a subtle balance between vigilance and confidence. Hannah stepped forward slightly. "Mr. Hardy, my husband has secured the funds to address the outstanding loan balance. $1,200 as specified in the original agreement." Hardy raised an eyebrow, genuine surprise crossing his features before he controlled his expression. Quite impressive given the timeline. "However, there are additional considerations. Late fees, processing costs." "No," Hannah's voice was calm but firm. "The original loan document is the unaltered versions Judge Wilson retains in his records specify no such additional fees. Any attempt to add costs now would constitute clear evidence of fraud." The direct accusation hung in the air. Mercer's hand drifted closer to his holstered pistol, a movement Ethan noted without appearing to notice. Hardy's eyes narrowed. "Mrs. Blackwood, you continue to make serious allegations without evidence." "On the contrary," Hannah produced a folded paper from her pocket. "This is a certified statement from Judge Wilson documenting the discrepancies between your version of the loan agreement and the court's registered copy. The differences in interest calculation alone constitute actionable fraud under territorial statutes." Ethan watched Hardy's face, seeing the calculation behind his eyes. The banker hadn't expected this level of preparation, this direct challenge to his methods. The balance of power was shifting visibly. "Additionally," Ethan added, "we've prepared formal complaints to the Territorial Banking Commission and the Land Office regarding your pattern of questionable foreclosure actions. Those will be withdrawn, of course, if our business concludes satisfactorily today." Hardy's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. You're taking considerable risks, Blackwood. A small rancher challenging a territorial bank rarely ends well. Perhaps. Ethan met his gaze steadily. But a small rancher with documented evidence of fraud, connections to the territorial judge, and $1,200 in certified bank drafts might fare better than you expect. A tense silence followed, broken only by the soft nickering of the horses and the distant call of a hawk circling overhead. Ethan could feel Hannah beside him, her presence steady and unwavering. They had planned this confrontation carefully, anticipated Hardy's responses, prepared their countermoves, like chess players working in tandem. Finally, Hardy nodded once, his expression unreadable. Very well. $1,200 as originally agreed. I'll have my clerk prepare a receipt acknowledging payment in full. We've prepared that as well, Hannah said smoothly, producing another document from her pocket, including language releasing any current or future claims against this property related to the loan. Hardy's eyes flashed with momentary anger, quickly suppressed. You've thought of everything, Mrs. Blackwood. Not everything, she replied evenly, just the essentials. The transaction proceeded with formal correctness. Ethan provided the bank drafts, 800 from his journey to Helena, 400 from the Prescott brothers, who had delivered their payment early that morning. Hardy examined each document carefully, finally nodding his acceptance. Hannah presented their prepared receipt, which Hardy signed after reading each word with narrow-eyed attention. Throughout, Mercer and his men maintained their watchful positions. The tension never fully dissipated, like a storm held momentarily at bay, but still threatening on the horizon. As Hardy folded the bank drafts into his coat pocket, he offered a smile that didn't reach his eyes. Congratulations, Blackwood. You've retained your ranch, for now. For good, Ethan corrected firmly. Our business is concluded, Hardy. This particular transaction, yes. Hardy replaced his hat, adjusting it precisely. But Clearwater is growing. The railroad brings opportunity. Future dealings may be inevitable. Perhaps. Ethan moved slightly, positioning himself between Hardy and Hannah in a subtle but deliberate motion. But any future business will be conducted properly, with witnesses and accurate documentation. I imagine Judge Wilson would insist on that. The implied warning was clear. Hardy studied him for a long moment, then turned toward his horse. Mrs. Blackwood, he said, nodding slightly in Hannah's direction, you've proven quite resourceful, an unexpected quality in a mail-order bride. And you've proven quite predictable, Mr. Hardy, Hannah replied coolly. Exactly the quality one expects in a man who values profit over principle. Hardy's smile tightened fractionally, the only indication her barb had landed. Without further comment, he mounted his horse, signaling his men to do the same. Moments later, they rode away, leaving only a cloud of dust and lingering tension in their wake. Ethan and Hannah remained on the porch, watching until the riders disappeared around the bend in the valley road. Only then did Ethan release the breath he hadn't realized he was holding. It's done, he said quietly. For now. Hannah's voice held no triumph, only pragmatic assessment. Hardy won't forget this easily. No, Ethan agreed, but we bought time, established boundaries. Hannah nodded, her eyes still on the distant horizon, and shown him were not easily intimidated. We, the word resonated between them. Ethan turned to face her fully. You were remarkable, Hannah. The preparation, the documentation, facing him directly. He hesitated, then added quietly, I'm grateful you're here. Not just for the ranch, but... He trailed off, suddenly uncertain how to express the complex evolution of his feelings. Hannah met his gaze, something softening in her eyes. I understand, she said simply. And he believed she did, better perhaps than he understood himself. Moses approached from the barn, shotgun still in hand but now held casually. They're gone proper, he reported, headed straight for town, not lingering. Good, Ethan nodded. We'll keep watches for a few days nonetheless. Hardy might not risk direct confrontation, but accidents have a way of happening on isolated ranches. Already arranged with the Prescott boys, Moses said. 2 men riding boundaries at all times, rotating shifts. He glanced between Ethan and Hannah, a knowing expression crossing his weathered face. Figure you two might want to celebrate your victory. I'll take first watch myself. Before either could respond, the old man turned and ambled back toward the barn, whistling tunelessly between missing teeth. Ethan felt a flush of embarrassment at Moses's obvious matchmaking, but Hannah merely smiled slightly. "He's invested in our arrangement," she observed. "Moses sees more than he lets on," Ethan acknowledged. "Always has." They returned inside, the midday heat giving way to the cooler interior of the house. The kitchen still smelled of morning coffee and baked bread, familiar and comforting after the tense confrontation. Hannah moved to pour fresh coffee, her movements containing the efficient grace Ethan had come to appreciate. "We should celebrate," he said suddenly. "Not just paying off Hardy, but everything, the ranch, the future." Hannah turned, surprise evident in her expression. "What did you have in mind?" Ethan hadn't planned this impulse, but now found himself committed. "Dinner, not here, in town, at the hotel restaurant." The suggestion hung between them. Ethan realized he was essentially proposing their first public appearance as a true couple, not a legal arrangement, not a practical partnership, but something more traditional, more genuine. Hannah touched the scarred side of her face in an unconscious gesture. "In town," she repeated softly, "where everyone would see us." "Yes," Ethan stepped closer. "Together. Let them see exactly who we are." The implication was clear. Not Blackwood and his disfigured mail-order bride, but Ethan and Hannah Blackwood, united partners who had faced down the town's most powerful man and prevailed. Hannah studied him, her gray eyes searching his face as if looking for uncertainty or pity. Finding neither, she nodded once. "I'd like that." The simple acceptance carried weight far beyond its words. Ethan felt something expand in his chest. Relief mingled with another emotion he wasn't quite ready to name. "Good," he said, his voice rougher than intended. "Tomorrow night, then." "Tomorrow." Hannah smiled fully then, a rare expression that transformed her face, illuminating both the scarred and unscarred sides with equal warmth. "I'll need to press my good dress." The domestic practicality of the statement struck Ethan with unexpected poignancy. This remarkable woman who had faced down Hardy with steely composure was also concerned about a pressed dress for dinner. The duality of strength and vulnerability, of practical partner and woman, crystallized something in his perception of her. Later that evening, after supper, they sat again on the porch watching twilight settle over the valley. The lengthening shadows brought a comfortable coolness after the day's heat. Neither spoke for some time, the silence between them easy and undemanding. "I read your journal," Hannah said finally, her voice quiet in the gathering dusk. "While you were gone, the one in your desk drawer." Ethan stiffened slightly, surprised by the admission. The journal contained his most private thoughts, particularly about Rebecca's death and the lonely years that followed. "I see," he said carefully. "I apologize for the intrusion," Hannah continued, her gaze on the distant mountains. "I was searching for any documentation that might help with Hardy. But once I began reading," she hesitated, "your words about loss, about this land, about rebuilding a life from grief, they resonated deeply." Ethan studied her profile silhouetted against the darkening sky. "They're just private thoughts, poorly expressed." "No," Hannah turned to face him directly. "They were beautifully expressed, honest in a way few people allow themselves to be, even privately." The unexpected praise warmed him. "Rebecca used to encourage my writing, said it helped balance the practical demands of ranching with reflection." "She was right," Hannah's voice softened. "Your descriptions of this valley through the seasons made me see it through your eyes, understanding why you fight so hard to keep it." Something significant was happening between them, Ethan realized. A new level of recognition and acknowledgement. Hannah had glimpsed his innermost thoughts and found value there. Not judgment or pity, but genuine appreciation. "When I arrived," she continued, "I thought this was simply a practical arrangement. Legal necessity for you, security for me. A transaction beneficial to both parties." She smiled slightly. "I never expected to find belonging." The word resonated deeply, belonging. Not just ownership or residence, but true connection. To the land, to the life they were building, and perhaps to each other. "Nor did I," Ethan admitted quietly. "After Rebecca, I thought that part of life was finished. That the best I could hope for was maintaining what we built together, honoring her memory through this land." "And now?" Hannah's question hung in the twilight air between them. Ethan considered carefully, wanting his words to reflect the complex evolution of his feelings. Now I see possibility again. Future, not just past. Hannah nodded, understanding in her eyes. Yes, exactly that. The connection between them deepened in that moment of shared recognition. Not romance in any conventional sense, but something perhaps more substantial. Mutual respect grown slowly into genuine affection, practical partnership enriched by deepening emotional bonds. Whatever Hardy attempts next, Ethan said, we'll face it together. Yes. Hannah's hand found his on the porch railing, her touch light but deliberate. Together. The simple contact, their first initiated by her, marked a threshold crossed. Ethan turned his hand beneath hers, their fingers interlacing naturally. They sat thus connected as the first stars appeared above the valley, neither needing words to acknowledge the significance of the moment. The next evening found them prepared for dinner in Clearwater with careful attention. Ethan wore his good suit, seldom used since his wedding to Rebecca. Hannah had indeed pressed her best dress, a deep blue that complemented her gray eyes and dark hair, which she had arranged more softly than her usual severe style. As they prepared to leave, Moses appeared from the barn to see them off, his weathered face creasing with approval. About time you two stepped out proper, he observed. Town needs reminding what quality looks like. Hannah smiled at the old man's blunt endorsement. Thank you, Moses, for everything. Just doing my job, ma'am. But the old man's eyes held genuine affection as he helped her into the buggy Ethan had polished that afternoon. The journey to town passed pleasantly, the evening cool enough for comfort, but mild enough to enjoy the landscape transformed by sunset hues. Ethan found himself pointing out features of the valley to Hannah. The hawk's nest high on the eastern ridge, the bend in the creek where he'd caught his first trout as a boy, the ancient pine where his father had carved his initials decades ago. Hannah listened with genuine interest, occasionally asking questions that revealed her growing attachment to the land. This wasn't merely Ethan's home that she occupied by arrangement. She was investing herself in understanding its history, its character, its significance. As they approached Clearwater, Ethan felt Hannah tense slightly beside him. He understood without asking. The town had not been kind in their previous visits. Stares, whispers, poorly concealed judgment had marked Hannah's reception from the beginning. We don't have to do this, he said quietly. We could turn back, dine at home. Hannah straightened, her profile resolute against the evening sky. No, I'm ready to be seen, Ethan. As myself, as your wife. The declaration carried unmistakable meaning. Not just legal designation, but chosen identity. Hannah Sullivan Blackwood had made her decision, claimed her place. The realization filled Ethan with unexpected warmth. Clearwater's main street was moderately busy with early evening activity as they drove through town toward the hotel. Ethan felt eyes tracking their progress, conversations pausing as they passed. The Blackwoods were evidently still subjects of interest and speculation. At the hotel, Ethan helped Hannah down from the buggy with formal courtesy, offering his arm as they approached the entrance. She accepted this public acknowledgement of their relationship with quiet dignity, her chin lifted slightly as they entered the hotel restaurant. Conversations dimmed momentarily as diners noticed their arrival. Ethan felt Hannah's hand tighten slightly on his arm, but her expression remained composed as the host approached. Mr. Blackwood, Mrs. Blackwood, the man acknowledged, his professional manner revealing nothing of his personal reaction to Hannah's scarred face. Your table is ready. Ethan had sent word ahead, requesting the best table, a deliberate statement about their standing in the community. As they followed the host through the restaurant, Ethan noted familiar faces among the diners. Judge Wilson nodded approvingly from one table. The Prescott brothers lifted glasses in silent salute from another. Even Mrs. Palmer, the minister's gossipy wife, managed a tight smile of acknowledgement. Their table overlooked the town square, a position of prominence impossible to ignore. Ethan seated Hannah with deliberate gallantry, then took his place opposite her. The message to Clearwater society was unmistakable. Hannah Sullivan Blackwood was his chosen partner, worthy of respect and public acknowledgement. Everyone is watching, Hannah observed quietly, unfolding her napkin with precise movements. Let them, Ethan replied. They'll see exactly what we want them to see. Partnership. Respect. A ghost of a smile touched Hannah's lips. And defiance? That too. Ethan found himself smiling in return, enjoying this moment of shared understanding. Especially that. As the meal progressed, Ethan noticed a subtle shift in the restaurant's atmosphere. The initial hushed attention gradually gave way to normal conversation, Hannah's presence becoming less extraordinary with each passing minute. By the time they were served dessert, apple pie with fresh cream, they were simply another couple dining, remarkable only in their evident comfort with each other. Walking back to their buggy afterward, Hannah paused in the town square, looking up at the star-filled sky above Clearwater. "Thank you for tonight," she said softly, "for making me visible in the right way." Ethan understood perfectly what she meant, not visible as an object of pity or curiosity, but as a woman of substance and dignity, his equal partner. "Thank you for being brave enough to be seen," he replied. "It matters, to me and to this community." Hannah turned to face him fully, the moonlight illuminating both sides of her face with equal clarity. In that moment, Ethan no longer saw divided features, scarred and unscarred. He saw simply Hannah, the complexity of her character reflected in her physical form. Beautiful in her entirety, not despite her scars, but inclusive of them. Acting on impulse, he reached out to touch her face, his fingers gently tracing the line where smooth skin met ridged scar tissue. Hannah remained perfectly still, her eyes searching his face as his thumb brushed her cheek. "I see you," he said quietly. "All of you." Something in Hannah's expression opened, vulnerability and strength intermingling. She lifted her own hand, covering his against her cheek. "And I see you, Ethan Blackwood. Not the man you were or the man you thought you'd be, but who you are now." The moment stretched between them, intimate and profound. Then, with gentle deliberation, Ethan leaned forward and placed a kiss on Hannah's forehead. Not passionate, but tender. An acknowledgement of connection that transcended their original arrangement. When he drew back, Hannah's eyes held a brightness that might have been unshed tears. But she smiled, a full expression that transformed her face with quiet joy. Together they walked to the buggy, their steps in natural unison, no longer needing words to navigate the shifting landscape between them. The ride home passed in comfortable silence, the spring night wrapping around them like a shared blanket. As the Blackwood Ranch came into view, outlined against the starlit sky, Ethan felt a sense of rightness settle in his chest. This land, this home, this woman beside him. Pieces of a life he hadn't sought, but now couldn't imagine surrendering. Moses had left a lamp burning on the porch, its warm glow a beacon guiding them home. Ethan helped Hannah down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. She didn't pull away. "I'll check the horses," he said, reluctant to end the evening, but aware of practical necessities. Hannah nodded. "I'll wait on the porch." True to her word, when Ethan returned from settling the horses, Hannah sat in one of the porch chairs, her face lifted to the night sky. She had removed her hat, allowing her dark hair to fall more freely around her shoulders. The simple change emphasized the transformation occurring between them, from formal arrangement to genuine intimacy. Ethan joined her, taking the adjacent chair. "The town will talk," he observed, "about us dining together publicly, making a statement." "Let them," Hannah replied, echoing his earlier sentiment. "They'll adjust to seeing us as we are, not as they assumed we would be." "And how are we?" Ethan asked, the question emerging before he had fully formed it in his mind. Hannah considered this thoughtfully. "Partners," she said finally, "in purpose, in respect, in belonging." She turned to meet his gaze directly. "In possibility." The word resonated between them, laden with meaning. Possibility. Not just survival or practical arrangement or legal necessity, but genuine growth, shared future, evolving connection. "I'd like that," Ethan said quietly. "So would I." The simple exchange held more significance than formal vows or passionate declarations. It acknowledged truth, that what had begun as transaction had grown organically into something neither had anticipated but both now valued deeply. As the night deepened around them, they remained on the porch, watching stars trace slow arcs across the Montana sky. The land stretched around them, valley and ridge, creek and forest, their shared dominion, hard-won and fiercely protected. Whatever Hardy might attempt next, Whatever challenges the changing territory might bring, they would face together. Not out of obligation, but choice. June arrived with explosions of wildflowers across the valley meadows, the land vibrant with renewed life. The Blackwood Ranch hummed with activity, cattle being moved to summer pasture, the garden flourishing under Hannah's careful attention, the old dairy shed gradually transformed for its original purpose. The railroad surveyors came as expected, offering fair payment for right-of-way access across the north corner of the property. Hardy, thwarted in his larger ambitions, had retreated to focus on more vulnerable targets, though his occasional appearance in Clearwater always brought watchful attention from the Blackwoods. On a particularly fine Sunday, Ethan found Hannah in her herb garden, harvesting early summer plants for her expanding collection of medicinal preparations. Her hair was tied back simply, her sleeves rolled up as she worked the soil with practiced hands. She had abandoned the severe, concealing styles of her arrival, no longer hiding her scarred face from the world or from herself. "The Prescotts invited us for dinner next Sunday," Ethan said, leaning against the garden fence. "Family gathering for James's birthday." Hannah looked up, shading her eyes against the sun. "That would be nice. Sarah Prescott mentioned wanting my cheese recipe last time we spoke." The casual exchange, plans shared, social connections acknowledged, struck Ethan with its comfortable normalcy. How far they had come from those first awkward days of careful distance and formal address. "I've been thinking," he said, moving to help her gather the harvested herbs into her basket, "about the future." Hannah glanced up, something softening in her expression. "What about it?" "The North pasture would support more dairy cows than we currently run. The cheese production is already showing profit." Ethan chose his words carefully. "With the railroad coming, we could expand significantly. Build something lasting." The implication was clear. Long-term vision, shared future, commitment beyond their original arrangement. Hannah set aside her garden tools, giving him her full attention. "That sounds like a solid plan," she said. Then with characteristic directness added, "Is that all you've been thinking about, Ethan?" The question invited honesty. Ethan met her gaze steadily. "No, I've been thinking about us, Hannah. How what began as practical necessity has become," he hesitated, searching for the right words, "essential. To me." Hannah's expression remained composed, but Ethan saw emotion in her eyes. "Essential," she repeated softly. "Yes, that's the word, isn't it? Not convenient or advantageous or sensible. Essential." Ethan reached for her hand, soil-stained and warm from gardening. "I'm not asking for what we don't yet have, just acknowledging what's grown between us. Partnership becoming more." Hannah's fingers tightened around his. "I'd like more, Ethan. When we're both ready." The simple statement contained volumes, acknowledgement of feelings evolving at their own pace, respect for lingering grief and healing scars, commitment to continued growth without artificial acceleration. "So would I," Ethan replied. In that moment of honest connection, surrounded by the land they both cherished, Ethan Blackwood and Hannah Sullivan Blackwood sealed a covenant deeper than their original agreement, not with passionate declarations or dramatic gestures, but with quiet recognition of what had already begun to flourish between them. That evening, they sat together on the porch, as had become their custom, watching twilight settle over the Montana Valley. Hannah worked on mending while Ethan whittled a piece of pine wood, domestic tranquility hard-won through shared struggle and growing understanding. "What are you making?" Hannah asked, nodding toward the wood taking shape beneath his knife. Ethan held up the emerging form. A small horse, details gradually emerging from the raw material. "For Judge Wilson's grandson, his birthday next week." Hannah smiled, the expression now coming more naturally to her. "It's beautiful. You have an artist's hands. My father taught me, said every man should create something lasting." Ethan returned to his careful strokes. He meant the ranch primarily, but these small things matter too. "Yes," Hannah's needle flashed in the fading light. "The big and small together make a life worth living." The philosophical observation, so characteristic of Hannah's thoughtful nature, settled between them comfortably. This was what they were building together, a life comprised of grand purposes and small moments, practical work and quiet companionship, hard-won battles and peaceful evenings. As darkness gathered and stars emerged overhead, Ethan felt contentment settle in his chest. Not the numb acceptance that had characterized the years after Rebecca's death, but genuine appreciation for present blessings, the land beneath them, the home around them, and most surprisingly, the woman beside him, all parts of a future he had once thought forever lost. Hannah looked up from her mending, catching his gaze. No words were needed in that moment of shared understanding. Whatever came next, Hardy's machinations, railroad development, changing seasons, they would face it together. Not from obligation, but from choice. Not from necessity, but from growing love. The Montana night deepened around Blackwood Ranch, stars wheeling overhead in ancient patterns. Inside the sturdy house, a lamp burned warm and steady, illuminating two people who had found in each other not what they sought, but what they needed: partnership, respect, belonging, and most precious of all, possibility. 5 years later, that possibility had blossomed into reality. The Blackwood Dairy now shipped cheese to markets as far as Denver, its reputation for quality spreading beyond Montana territory. The old milking shed had expanded into a proper dairy operation, employing 3 local women trained in Hannah's Vermont techniques. The north pasture, once empty, now supported 30 dairy cows, their black and white coats dotting the green landscape like moving clouds. The ranch house had grown too, with a new wing added for the small medical clinic where Hannah now treated townspeople and travelers alike, her herbal remedies complementing DeWilson's more conventional approaches. Her scarred face, once hidden behind veils, had become a familiar and respected sight in Clearwater, a symbol of competence and healing. But the most significant change stood at Hannah's side as she watched the summer sunset from their favorite hillside. A 3-year-old boy with Ethan's blue eyes and her determined chin, pointing excitedly at hawks circling above. Thomas Moses Blackwood, named for both their fathers and the old ranch hand who had seen their potential before they did. "One day all this will be yours," Ethan told his son, his hand resting protectively on the boy's shoulder. "Not just the land, but what it means." Hannah met her husband's gaze over their child's head, understanding in her eyes. What had begun as a transaction of necessity had transformed into a legacy of choice. Land healed by care, scars honored rather than hidden, love built slowly but anchored in bedrock. The wildlands had shaped them, and they had shaped the wildlands in return. Season after season, year after year, each writing their story into the very soil beneath their feet, a story that would continue long after they were gone, carried forward by the child between them and the land that held them all.